Before diving into this heart-wrenching story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our most emotional tales. If you love stories that touch the soul and showcase extraordinary destinies, this channel is made for you. Click that subscribe button now. Chapter 1. She knocked at the Duke's door after his wife passed. The hungry baby found its only hope in her arms. The autumn of 1863 shrouded Thornfield Manor in a veil of mourning that seemed to seep into every stone of the ancient Yorkshire estate. The Duke of Thornfield, William Ashworth, moved through the grand halls of his ancestral home like a ghost haunting his own life, his footsteps echoing in chambers that had once rung with laughter, but now held only the oppressive silence of profound grief. 3 weeks had passed since the Duchess Isabel had drawn her last breath, succumbing to complications following the birth of their first child. And the Duke found himself drowning in a sorrow so deep it threatened to consume what remained of his shattered existence. William was 35 years old, a man in the prime of his life who had possessed everything the world could offer: wealth beyond measure, a title stretching back centuries, vast estates spanning 3 counties, and most precious of all, a wife whose beauty was matched only by her gentle spirit and loving heart. Isabel had been his childhood companion, his dearest friend, his passionate lover, and his devoted wife for 8 blissful years of marriage. Her death had torn from him not just a beloved partner, but the very foundation upon which his happiness and sense of purpose had been built. The baby, a fragile son they had named Charles after William's grandfather, lay in the nursery, attended by a succession of wet nurses who came and went with alarming frequency. The infant seemed to sense the tragedy that had marked his entrance into the world, crying incessantly with a wail that pierced through the manor's thick walls and reached even to William's study, where the Duke sought refuge in expensive whiskey and bitter memories. Each cry was a reminder of the price paid for the child's life, each whimper an accusation that William could barely endure. "Your Grace," ventured Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly housekeeper who had served the family for 30 years. "The baby hasn't taken well to the new nurse either. This is the 4th one this month, and little Master Charles grows weaker each day. Perhaps we should send to London for a specialist." William looked up from the letter he was writing with trembling hands, the 20th attempt to compose something coherent to his late wife's parents. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and warmth, had become dull pools of anguish that seemed to hold no spark of the vital man he had once been. "Do whatever you think best, Mrs. Hartwell," he replied in the hollow voice that had become his norm. "I cannot bear to see him. Every time I look at that child, I see her face, and I remember what his life has cost." This terrible confession hung in the air between them like a dark cloud. Mrs. Hartwell, who had helped raise William from boyhood and loved him like her own son, felt her heart break anew at witnessing his complete spiritual collapse. She understood his pain. Indeed, she had wept privately for hours over the loss of sweet Lady Isabel, but she also knew that somewhere within this devastated man lay the strength to heal, if only he could find a reason to try. The October rain that had been falling steadily for days seemed to echo the Duke's internal storms, drumming against the diamond-paned windows with a persistence that matched his grief. It was on just such an evening, as William sat alone in his darkened study, with only the dying fire for company, that an unexpected sound cut through the manor's oppressive silence. A firm, determined knocking at the great front door. Mrs. Hartwell, surprised by any visitor calling at such an hour during the family's period of mourning, made her way to the entrance hall with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Social protocol dictated that the household should not be receiving callers, but something about the persistence of the knocking suggested urgency rather than mere social obligation. When she opened the heavy oak door, she discovered a sight that would remain etched in her memory forever. A young woman stood on the doorstep, soaked through by the driving rain, but holding her head high with remarkable dignity despite her obvious distress. She appeared to be no more than 25, with dark auburn hair plastered to her head and clothes that, while well made, had clearly seen better days. But what struck Mrs. Hartwell most powerfully was not the woman's bedraggled appearance, but the expression in her deep green eyes, a combination of desperation and determination that spoke of someone who had come to this door as her last hope. "Please," the young woman said, her voice clear and educated despite the chattering of her teeth, "I must speak with His Grace. I know this is highly irregular, given the recent tragedy, and I would not presume to disturb him if the matter were not of utmost urgency. My name is Miss Catherine Pembroke, and I believe I may be able to help with the baby's difficulties." Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose in surprise. News of the infant's troubles had been carefully contained within the household, yet this stranger spoke as if she possessed some knowledge of the situation. "I'm afraid His Grace is not receiving visitors, miss," she began diplomatically, "and I cannot imagine how you might have heard—" "I was the Duchess's personal maid," Catherine interrupted softly, "before her marriage. I served her from childhood until she wed the Duke, and she was more like a sister to me than an employer. I was working in a household in London when I heard of her passing and the baby's struggles. I have some experience with difficult infants, and I couldn't bear the thought that her child might suffer when I might be able to help." This revelation transformed everything. Mrs. Hartwell remembered the devoted maid who had been such a comfort to Lady Isabel during her youth, though the girl had moved to London when her mistress had no longer needed her services. The housekeeper's expression softened as she recognized in Catherine's rain-soaked figure someone who had genuinely loved the late Duchess and might indeed possess special skills that could help the failing infant. "Come in at once, child," Mrs. Hartwell said, stepping aside to admit the unexpected visitor. "You'll catch your death in this weather. Let me get you dried off and fed, and then we'll see about speaking with His Grace. Though I warn you, he's not been himself since the tragedy." Catherine stepped into the warm grandeur of Thornfield Manor with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. She had never seen the Duke's home during her years of service to Lady Isabel, but she could imagine her beloved mistress moving through these magnificent rooms, bringing light and joy to every corner. Now the manor felt like a tomb, beautiful but lifeless, as if all happiness had departed with the woman who had once been its heart. As Mrs. Hartwell led her toward the servants' quarters to be warmed and fed, Catherine's trained ear caught the sound that had driven her to make this desperate journey, the weak, pitiful crying of an infant who was clearly in distress. Her heart clenched with pain as she recognized in that sound the voice of Lady Isabel's child, the baby who represented all that remained of the woman who had been like family to her. "The baby," Catherine said, stopping in the corridor. "How long has he been crying like that?" "Near constantly for days," Mrs. Hartwell replied with weary sadness. "Nothing we do seems to comfort him. He won't take milk properly from any of the wet nurses, and each day he grows thinner and weaker. The doctors say—" She paused, unwilling to voice the grim prognosis. "May I see him?" Catherine asked with quiet urgency. "Perhaps there's something—" "Lady Isabel used to say I had a way with troubled babies. I helped care for her younger cousins when they were infants." Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, knowing that such a request was highly irregular, but something in Catherine's manner convinced her that this young woman might indeed possess the help they so desperately needed. "Very well," she decided, "but first let me see about getting you into dry clothes. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from pneumonia." 20 minutes later, dressed in borrowed servants' clothes that were too large but blissfully dry, Catherine followed Mrs. Hartwell up the grand staircase toward the nursery wing. With each step, the baby's cries grew louder and more heartbreaking, a sound that seemed to embody all the grief and loss that had befallen this once happy house. When they reached the nursery, Catherine's heart nearly broke at the sight that greeted her. A beautiful room that should have been filled with joy and wonder had become a place of anxiety and failure. The current wet nurse, a capable-looking woman in her 40s, sat holding the tiny Duke Charles with an expression of frustrated defeat. "He won't take the milk, ma'am," the nurse said to Mrs. Hartwell. "I've tried everything I know, but he just pushes it away and cries harder. I fear he's simply not meant for this world." Catherine approached slowly, her heart aching as she saw the tiny, red-faced infant who bore such a striking resemblance to his departed mother. Without asking permission, she extended her arms toward the baby, and to everyone's amazement, the nurse found herself handing over the child as if compelled by some invisible force. The moment Catherine took little Charles into her arms, something magical seemed to happen. Her voice, soft and melodious, began to hum a lullaby that Lady Isabel had loved, a gentle tune that seemed to resonate with some deep memory in the baby's consciousness. Gradually, incredibly, the crying began to subside, replaced by the hiccuping sobs of an infant finally finding comfort after long suffering. "There now, precious one," Catherine whispered, cradling the baby with practiced skill. "Your mama loved you so much, and she's watching over you still. You're safe now, little lord. You're going to be just fine." As if responding to some primal recognition of genuine care and love, baby Charles nestled against Catherine's breast, and for the first time in days seemed truly peaceful. The transformation was so immediate and complete that both Mrs. Hartwell and the wet nurse stared in wonder at this miracle they were witnessing. It was at this moment that William, drawn by the unusual silence where crying had been constant, appeared in the nursery doorway and witnessed a scene that would change his life forever. A young woman he didn't recognize, holding his son with such tender love that the child had finally found peace, and in her gentle care, perhaps his only hope for survival. Chapter 2. The Healing Touch. The Duke William Ashworth stood frozen in the nursery doorway, his hand gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles showed white against the polished wood. For 3 weeks he had avoided this room, unable to bear the sight of the child whose birth had cost him everything he held dear. Yet now he found himself transfixed by the extraordinary scene unfolding before him. This mysterious young woman, whom he had never seen before, held his son with such natural tenderness that little Charles had fallen into the first peaceful sleep he had known since entering this world of sorrow. "Who is this woman?" William asked in a voice barely above a whisper, his eyes never leaving the gentle tableau of Catherine cradling his son. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward nervously, aware that she had taken considerable liberties in allowing a stranger access to the nursery without the Duke's permission. "Your Grace, this is Miss Catherine Pembroke. She was Lady Isabel's personal maid before your marriage. She came here tonight, having heard of the baby's difficulties, believing she might be able to help." At the mention of his late wife's name, William's jaw tightened, and a flash of pain crossed his features. Yet he could not deny what his own eyes witnessed. His son, who had cried ceaselessly for days and refused to take nourishment from anyone, now lay peacefully in this woman's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of healthy sleep. "How?" William asked, stepping reluctantly into the room, drawn despite himself by this inexplicable transformation in his child's condition. Catherine looked up to meet the Duke's gaze for the first time, and her heart contracted with sympathy at what she saw there. This was a man hollowed out by grief, his fine features aged by suffering beyond his years, his dark eyes holding depths of pain that seemed almost unbearable to witness. She understood now why Lady Isabel had loved him so deeply. Beneath the current mask of anguish lay evidence of the intelligent, compassionate man her mistress had described in her letters. "Babies sense our emotions more keenly than we realize, Your Grace," Catherine replied softly, her voice carefully modulated to avoid disturbing the sleeping infant. "Little Charles has been surrounded by grief and anxiety since his birth. He needed someone to hold him with joy rather than sorrow, with hope rather than fear. Lady Isabel would have wanted him to feel loved, not blamed for her passing. These words, spoken with gentle conviction, hit William like physical blows. He staggered slightly, gripping a nearby chair as the truth of her observations sank into his consciousness. In his overwhelming grief, he had indeed blamed the child for his wife's death, had seen in the baby's face only the reminder of his devastating loss, rather than the miracle of new life that should be celebrated. "I cannot," William began, his voice breaking with emotion. "Every time I see him, I remember. I cannot separate the joy of his existence from the agony of losing her." "No, you don't have to forget your grief to love your son," Catherine said with surprising authority for someone speaking to a duke. "Lady Isabel gave her life to bring him into this world because she believed he was worth that sacrifice. To deny him love now would make her death meaningless. She would want you to see in him not her end, but her greatest gift to you." The wet nurse and Mrs. Hartwell exchanged meaningful glances, both recognizing that this young woman possessed not only an extraordinary way with children, but also the courage and wisdom to speak truths that needed to be heard, regardless of the social gulf between herself and her noble employer. William sank heavily into the nursery's rocking chair, his head in his hands as years of suppressed emotion finally found release. "I have been such a fool," he whispered. "Such a selfish, blind fool. She died bringing him life, and I have spent these weeks wishing he had never been born." "Grief makes us all fools sometimes," Catherine replied with infinite gentleness. "But it's not too late to change. He's still so young, still capable of learning that he is loved and wanted. All he needs is someone willing to see past their own pain, to recognize his need for affection." As if summoned by some unconscious signal, baby Charles stirred in Catherine's arms and opened his eyes that were unmistakably his mother's, the same warm brown that had captivated William during their courtship. But instead of seeing in them the accusation he had imagined, William now observed only innocent trust and the natural seeking of a child for parental love. "May I hold him?" William asked hesitantly, as if requesting permission to embrace his own son. Catherine rose gracefully and moved toward the Duke, carefully transferring the infant to his father's trembling arms. "Port his head like this," she instructed gently, "and speak to him. He knows your voice from hearing it in his mother's womb." For a moment, William simply stared down at the tiny being in his arms, overwhelmed by the reality of fatherhood that he had been denying. "Hello, Charles," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your father. I'm sorry I haven't been here for you. I promise I'll try to do better." The baby gazed up at him with that unfocused attention of newborns, but there was something in the child's expression that seemed to recognize this important moment. Catherine watched with tears in her eyes as she witnessed the beginning of the bond between father and son that should have formed at birth, but had been delayed by the Duke's overwhelming grief. "He's beautiful," William said wonderingly, as if seeing his child clearly for the first time. "He has her eyes, but his chin, that's from my family line." "He's going to be a handsome man," Catherine agreed. "And with proper care and love, he'll grow to be someone both you and Lady Isabel would be proud of." At that moment, as if to validate this hopeful prediction, baby Charles yawned and settled more comfortably in his father's arms, clearly content to remain there. Mrs. Hartwell wiped her eyes with her handkerchief, moved by this touching scene of reconciliation between the Duke and his heir. "Miss Pembroke," William said without taking his eyes from his son, "would you consider remaining at Thornfield to help with Charles? It's clear that you have skills with children that we desperately need, and I would be grateful for your guidance as I learn to be the father he deserves." Catherine's heart leaped at this unexpected opportunity to remain close to Lady Isabel's child and to help ensure his well-being. "I would be honored, Your Grace. Lady Isabel meant everything to me, and caring for her son would be a privilege, not a duty." Then it's settled, William decided with the first note of decisive authority he had shown since his wife's death. Mrs. Hartwell, please prepare suitable quarters for Miss Pembroke near the nursery. She shall serve as Charles's primary nurse and governess with whatever assistance she requires. As the small group made arrangements for Catherine's permanent residence at Thornfield Manor, none of them could have predicted that this night would mark not only the salvation of baby Charles, but the beginning of a relationship between the grieving Duke and the compassionate young woman that would ultimately heal both their hearts and transform their understanding of what family could mean. The baby stirred again in his father's arms, and this time William responded not with pain, but with wonder at the small miracle he held, a miracle that Catherine had helped him recognize and embrace. In her gentle intervention, both father and son had found exactly what they needed: hope for the future and the beginning of healing for wounds that had seemed too deep to mend. Chapter 3. The Unfolding of Hearts. The months that followed Catherine's arrival at Thornfield Manor brought a transformation so profound that visitors to the estate could scarcely believe this was the same household that had been shrouded in such devastating grief. Under Catherine's devoted care, baby Charles flourished as only a truly loved child can, growing plump and healthy while developing that bright responsiveness that comes from secure attachment and consistent affection. But perhaps even more remarkable was the gradual healing of the Duke himself, who slowly emerged from his cocoon of sorrow to reclaim his role as both father and master of his domain. Catherine had settled into her new life at Thornfield with the grateful efficiency of someone who had finally found her true calling. Her quarters, a comfortable suite adjacent to the nursery, became the warm center of the baby's world, filled with the gentle sounds of lullabies, soft conversation, and the contented gurgles of an infant who knew himself to be cherished. She approached her duties with the perfect combination of professional competence and genuine love, treating little Charles not as merely another charge to be managed, but as the precious legacy of the woman who had meant everything to her. William found himself drawn to the nursery wing with increasing frequency, initially using the excuse of checking on his son's welfare, but gradually acknowledging to himself that Catherine's presence had become a source of comfort and peace that he craved. There was something remarkably soothing about watching her with Charles, the way she could calm his fussing with just a few soft words, how she anticipated his needs before he could even express them, the natural grace with which she moved through the routines of infant care that had seemed so mysterious and overwhelming to everyone else. "She has a gift," Mrs. Hartwell confided to the estate steward one evening. "It's not just that she knows about babies, though she certainly does. It's that she genuinely loves our little master, as if he were her own. And his grace, well, I haven't seen him smile so readily since before Lady Isabel's passing." Indeed, William was discovering that his conversations with Catherine had become the highlight of his days. What began as simple discussions about Charles's feeding schedule and developmental progress had evolved into wide-ranging talks about literature, music, philosophy, and the complex emotional landscape of grief and healing. Catherine possessed an educated mind that could engage with his own intellectual interests, but more importantly, she had an intuitive understanding of the human heart that helped him navigate the treacherous waters of his mourning process. "Do you think it's wrong of me to feel happy sometimes?" William asked her one evening as they sat in the nursery, watching Charles practice his newfound ability to grasp at colorful toys. "When I laugh at something you've said or feel genuine pleasure in watching him discover the world, I feel as though I'm betraying Isabel's memory." Catherine considered this carefully before responding, her fingers gently stroking the baby's soft hair as he lay contentedly in her lap. "I think Lady Isabel would be heartbroken to know that her death had stolen all joy from your life forever," she replied thoughtfully. "She loved you deeply. I saw how her face would light up whenever she spoke of you. Don't you think she would want you to find happiness again, especially in loving the child you created together. This perspective, delivered with Catherine's characteristic blend of gentleness and wisdom, helped William begin to separate his grief for his wife from his growing attachment to his son. He started to see that honoring Isabel's memory didn't require perpetual sorrow, but rather the cultivation of the love and joy she had brought into his life, now redirected toward the precious child who carried her legacy forward. As winter melted into spring, William noticed other changes in himself that could only be attributed to Catherine's influence. Her natural optimism and quiet strength seemed to counterbalance his tendency toward melancholy, while her practical compassion gave him a model for engaging with the world beyond his own grief. She had a way of listening that made him feel truly heard, and her responses to his questions and concerns revealed a depth of insight that he found increasingly invaluable. Catherine, for her part, was fighting a battle of her own, a growing awareness that her feelings for the Duke had evolved far beyond professional respect or even friendship. She found herself looking forward to their evening conversations with an anticipation that had nothing to do with discussing baby Charles, and she caught herself watching William's face for signs of returning happiness with an intensity that went well beyond concern for her employer's welfare. The realization that she was falling in love with him filled her with both joy and terror, for she understood perfectly the impossibility of such feelings. The gulf between their social stations was vast and unbridgeable by conventional standards. She was a servant, albeit a trusted and valued one, while he was a duke whose eventual remarriage would necessarily involve considerations of lineage, wealth, and social advantage that no amount of personal compatibility could overcome. To allow herself to hope for anything beyond her current position would be the height of foolishness, yet she found it increasingly difficult to guard her heart against the growing affection she felt for this complicated, wounded, fundamentally good man who had become the center of her world. Their relationship might have continued indefinitely in this state of unacknowledged mutual attraction, disguised as professional cooperation, if not for an incident that forced both of them to confront the true nature of their feelings. It occurred on a particularly beautiful May evening when William had joined Catherine in the garden, where she often took Charles for fresh air and sunshine. The baby, now nearly 8 months old, was sitting on a blanket attempting to crawl, while Catherine and William sat nearby on a bench, ostensibly supervising his efforts, but actually deep in conversation about a book they had both recently read. "I should return to the house," Catherine said reluctantly as the sun began to set. "Charles needs his evening feeding, and I want to give him a bath before bedtime." As she rose to gather up the baby, her foot caught in the edge of the blanket, causing her to stumble. William's reflexes, honed by years of riding and hunting, kicked in instantly, and he caught her in his arms, pulling her against his chest to prevent her fall. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they remained frozen in this intimate embrace, her hands pressed against his shirt front, his arms wrapped securely around her waist, their faces mere inches apart. The awareness that crackled between them in that moment was impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Catherine felt her breath catch as she looked up into William's dark eyes and saw there not just gratitude or friendship, but unmistakable desire. William, for his part, felt as though he was awakening from a long dream to discover that the woman in his arms had become essential to his happiness in ways that went far beyond her care of his son. "Catherine," he whispered, her name on his lips like a prayer. "Your Grace," she replied breathlessly, but made no attempt to pull away from his embrace. They might have kissed then. Indeed, every fiber of their being seemed to be drawing them toward that inevitable conclusion. But baby Charles chose that moment to let out an indignant cry at being temporarily forgotten, breaking the spell and reminding them both of their respective roles and responsibilities. Catherine quickly stepped back, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and confusion. The baby needs..." "Of course," William agreed, though his own voice was unsteady. We should get him inside. As they gathered Charles and his belongings, both acutely aware of the charged atmosphere between them, neither could deny that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The careful boundaries they had maintained were beginning to crumble under the weight of emotions that could no longer be contained or ignored. That night, as Catherine settled Charles in his crib and prepared for bed, she found herself replaying every second of their near kiss, wondering what might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted and whether William's feelings truly mirrored her own. Meanwhile, in his study, William sat staring into the fire, finally admitting to himself that his feelings for Catherine had grown into something that could only be called love. A realization that filled him with equal measures of joy and despair as he contemplated the seemingly insurmountable obstacles that stood between them and any hope of a shared future. Chapter 4. Love Conquers All Boundaries. The tension that had developed between William and Catherine following their charged moment in the garden created an atmosphere of sweet torment that neither could ignore nor resolve. They found themselves caught between propriety and passion, duty and desire, in a dance of restrained longing that grew more difficult to maintain with each passing day. Their conversations became carefully formal, yet their eyes spoke volumes that words could not safely express. William took to avoiding the nursery during Catherine's evening routines, while she found excuses to minimize their private interactions, both attempting to preserve what remained of appropriate boundaries. This careful avoidance might have continued indefinitely if fate had not intervened in the form of baby Charles, falling seriously ill with a fever that frightened everyone in the household. The child, who had been thriving under Catherine's devoted care, suddenly became listless and hot to the touch, refusing to eat and crying with a weakness that spoke of genuine distress. Catherine, who had never left his side during the 3 days of his illness, was herself on the verge of collapse from exhaustion and worry when the crisis finally broke. William, who had maintained his own vigil outside the nursery, was pacing the corridor like a caged animal when he heard Catherine's voice calling his name with an urgency that sent ice through his veins. Rushing into the nursery, he found her kneeling beside the baby's crib, tears streaming down her face as she looked up at him with eyes full of desperation. "His fever has broken," she whispered, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I think he's going to be all right." The relief that flooded through William was so intense it buckled his knees, and he dropped down beside Catherine, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch his son's forehead and confirmed that the dangerous heat had indeed receded. "Thank God," he breathed. "Thank God and thank you. You saved him, Catherine. You saved my son." "I couldn't bear to lose him," Catherine sobbed, all her careful emotional control finally cracking under the strain of the last 3 days. "He's all I have left of her, all that remains of the woman who was like a sister to me, if something had happened to him." It was William's turn to offer comfort, and without thinking of propriety or consequences, he gathered Catherine into his arms, holding her close as she wept with the exhausted relief of someone who had fought death and won. "He's safe," William murmured against her hair. "He's safe because of you, because of your love and devotion. I don't know what we would have done without you." As Catherine's tears gradually subsided, she became aware of the impropriety of her position. Clasped in the Duke's arms, her defenses completely lowered, her heart exposed and vulnerable. She should have pulled away, resumed the proper distance between them, but she found herself unable to move from the circle of his embrace, unable to give up the comfort and security she found there. "Catherine," William said softly, "I need to tell you something that I should have said weeks ago. What I feel for you, it's not gratitude, though I am grateful beyond words. It's not mere friendship, though I treasure your companionship. It's deep, abiding love that grows stronger every day, despite my efforts to contain it." These words, spoken with quiet conviction, shattered the last barriers around Catherine's heart. "William," she whispered, using his given name for the first time, "I love you too. I have tried not to, tried to remember my place and your position, but I cannot help myself. You have become everything to me." Their kiss, when it finally came, was worth all the weeks of restraint and uncertainty they had endured. It was tender and passionate, desperate and reverent all at once, the meeting of two souls who had found in each other the missing pieces of their hearts. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling with the force of emotions too long suppressed. "This is impossible," Catherine said, though she made no attempt to leave his arms. "You're a duke, I'm a servant. The world will never accept such a union." "The world," William replied firmly, "can go to the devil. I have learned these past months that love is rarer and more precious than any social convention. I nearly lost my son because I allowed grief to blind me to what was truly important. I will not make that mistake again with my heart. I love you, Catherine Pembroke, and I want you to be my wife." The proposal, coming so suddenly after months of unspoken feelings, left Catherine speechless with joy and terror. But the scandal, your position in society. "My family consists of you and Charles," William said decisively. "My position in society means nothing if I cannot share it with the woman I love. As for scandal, let them talk. I would rather face their whispers with you beside me than endure a lifetime of respectability without you." The weeks that followed this declaration were indeed filled with shock, dismay, and fierce opposition from various quarters. William's solicitors warned him about the legal complications of such a marriage. His few remaining relatives expressed their horror at this mésalliance, and London society buzzed with scandalized gossip about the Duke who intended to marry his child's nursemaid. But William faced each obstacle with the same determination he had once shown on the hunting field, refusing to be swayed by social pressure or family disapproval. Catherine, for her part, struggled with moments of doubt about the wisdom of accepting his proposal. She understood better than William did the challenges they would face, the whispers that would follow them, the doors that would close against them. But every time she wavered, she had only to look at baby Charles, thriving, happy, secure in the love of both his father and the woman who had become his mother in everything but blood, to remember what truly mattered in life. Their wedding, held in the private chapel of Thornfield Manor 6 months later, was a simple ceremony attended only by the household staff and a handful of William's closest friends who chose loyalty over social convention. Catherine wore a gown of ivory silk that transformed her from nursemaid to duchess with stunning elegance, while William looked upon her with such obvious adoration that even the most cynical observers were moved by the genuine love between them. "Do you, William Alexander Ashworth, take Catherine Elizabeth Pembroke to be your lawfully wedded wife?" asked the rector, his voice carrying clearly through the small but beautifully appointed chapel. "I do," William replied with absolute conviction, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "And do you, Catherine Elizabeth Pembroke, take William Alexander Ashworth to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Catherine answered, her voice steady despite the tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. When they were pronounced husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by baby Charles, now a robust toddler who clapped his hands with delight from Mrs. Hartwell's arms, understanding perhaps better than the adults around him that this moment marked the completion of their little family. In the years that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield proved that love indeed conquers all boundaries. Catherine grew into her role with grace and dignity that silenced even her harshest critics, while William found in her partnership the strength to become not just a better father, but a better man. Their marriage produced 3 more children, who grew up with Charles as their beloved elder brother, creating a family united not by obligation or convenience, but by genuine affection and mutual respect. When historians later wrote about the Ashworth family, they noted that the marriage between the Duke and his former nursemaid became legendary, not for its initial scandal, but for its enduring happiness and the positive impact it had on the entire estate. Catherine's understanding of the common people, combined with William's resources and position, led to reforms and improvements that made Thornfield a model for other great estates throughout England. And at the heart of it all remained the truth that had brought them together in the first place. Sometimes the greatest love comes not from the expected places, but from the courage to see past social conventions to the heart of what truly matters. In saving baby Charles, Catherine had saved them all, proving that love, when it arrives in unexpected forms, has the power to heal the deepest wounds and create families bound by choice, rather than mere circumstance. Thank you for joining us in this heartwarming tale that proves love knows no boundaries, and that sometimes our greatest blessings come in the most unexpected forms. If this story moved you, please subscribe immediately to our channel to discover more touching tales that celebrate the power of love to transform lives and overcome any obstacle. Your next emotional journey awaits.